Freedom is not free. Discover what it takes. It's time to tap and move forward.
Hello and welcome to Tap and Move Forward. I'm your host, Lynn Shelley. You may remember in episode 6, Ryan Fleishman talked about raising money to benefit a program to reduce suicidal ideation in veterans. This episode is the interview with the man who leads that program, Dr. Craig Bryan. He is a board-certified clinical psychologist in cognitive behavioral psychology, and he deployed himself to Iraq in 2009, where he served as the director of the Traumatic Brain Injury Clinic. Currently, he is the executive director of the National Center for Veterans Studies at the University of Utah. Dr. Bryan has published over 150 scientific articles and several books. In this interview, he has some great analogies and insights for mental strength. Without further delay, here is the interview with Dr. Craig Bryan. Why did you join the military and how old were you?
So I was, I guess I was around 24, 25 years old. It was in 2005. And so I joined because, 9/11 happened right in my last semester of college. I was just about ready to graduate. I was actually working full-time, just taking one last class. And I was working graveyard shifts. And so I actually slept through 9/11, and I woke up the next morning and was just getting ready for my day. I was actually going out on a date that night, and my date called and, basically said, "You don't even know what's going on. Turn on the news." And that was how I found out about 9/11. And, I went to graduate school soon after to start working on my doctorate in psychology. I wanted to be a psychologist. And it was while we were in graduate school that the idea of joining the military actually first came to mind. And I think the idea, now I look back on it and I could see that the idea first came when I was a first year student and we were in a therapy class and the invasion of Iraq started. And the instructor said before we started the class, he just wanted to talk about the invasion, and he said, that his concern was that we as a nation were not fully discussing the consequences of war. We almost had this attitude of you just kind of go and engage in violence and aggression and do war, and you don't have to worry about what happens as a result of that and the long downstream effects. And I remember him saying that, as future psychologists, all of you will play a role in the consequences of the Iraq War. And that's part of what we do as psychologists is we help people. And some of you will work in VAs and, work with military personnel and veterans. And at that time, I certainly didn't give too much thought to joining the military, but several years later, I could realize that was kind of the first moment that the idea really popped into my head. And my training director, my mentor, was an Army psychologist. He was in Gulf War I, and he just encouraged me while I was in graduate school. He said, "You need to join the military. You'd be good for the military. You'd really enjoy the experience." And I dismissed him. I did not come from a military family in the traditional sense and was like, what are you talking about? But once the time came towards the end of my graduate training to kind of look at what we call internship, we do internships before we receive our doctorates, I looked at the military and it was not what I was expecting. And that was when I joined. It was kind of right before the surge in Iraq. And so I joined the military, commissioned, and then once I was an intern, we were right in the heart of the surge. And so deployments were increasing, and the role of a psychologist was undergoing a sort of vast redesign within the military as a result. And so, yes, that's kind of the story. And I joined because I kind of felt like I had something to contribute, and I wanted to work shoulder to shoulder with those who were engaged in the war fighting effort, and wanted to kind of wear the uniform with them and take care of them.
And so when you joined directly as a psychologist?
Yeah. So the Navy, Army, and the Air Force all have basically these training programs. So as a psychologist, you go to school for several years, and then you do what's called a pre-doctoral internship, where basically you just work full-time as a psychologist and you're supervised. So it's this very intensive applied part of the training, kind of the capstone. And then once you've done this full year of very intensive training, that's when you receive your doctorate. And the three branches there that have medical services and medical programs all have these internships, and that's how actually a lot of military psychologists join the military, at least the uniformed psychologists, as we enter through these pre-doctoral internship programs where we're trained for a year under the supervision of other military psychologists, both uniformed, GS, and sometimes contractors. And then we have a payback, so 3 to 4 year active duty commitment as a trade-off for that training experience.
Was there any big surprises or anything that you didn't expect that you learned after joining the military?
I think when I joined, as I mentioned before, we were right before the surge in Iraq, and so deployments for psychologists, at least in the Air Force. So I joined the Air Force, and deployments for psychologists tended to be, relatively short, 3 to 4 months, and not necessarily in a combat zone. But as the surge started, DoD started pulling Air Force psychologists to do deployments that were not typical for Air Force psychologists. So 3 to 4 month deployments were now 6 months, sometimes 12 months. In some cases, we were embedding with Army units, backfilling Army psychologists because the Army was just being stretched thin due to the surge. And so we started getting deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan rather than, Kuwait and Qatar and, Kyrgyzstan. And so from the time that I joined to the time that I, was actually in the Air Force, the mission changed dramatically. And so it was kind of an interesting time for Air Force psychology, because a lot of people were saying this is not what I signed up for, and so they were, getting out of the Air Force quicker than maybe they had initially planned. Whereas my cohort was kind of in this in-between stage, where those who came after us, it's kind of like, you're going to deploy, you're going to go to a combat zone, and you might be gone for a year, and you need to prepare for this. And we started training psychologists to prepare for that, whereas we were in this transition phase. And so that was, I think, definitely something that was unexpected for many of us. But I think because we had joined at a time where military operations were ramping up, our generation, our cohort was, a little bit more open to those opportunities. And, I think we adapted to them very well.
And so you did deploy?
Yeah, so I deployed to Iraq in 2009. And was stationed at Joint Base Balad at the Air Force Theater Hospital. So it used to be called LSA Anaconda, and then the Air Force took over, and we had one of our big downrange hospitals located there.
What did the deployment look like for you?
So I was there for about 6 to 6.5 months. And my primary mission was to run the traumatic brain injury clinic. And so there are two major hospitals in Iraq. There's the one in Baghdad and then ours in Balad. And, so a lot of servicemen service members were being sent to us with head injuries that are being blown up, vehicles rolling over, but I would say also sort of the non-sexy injuries. So, sports injuries, slipping and falling in the shower, things like that. And there are so many head injuries that, a few years before I got there, basically the psychologists deployed at the time set up this traumatic brain injury clinic so that we weren't taking beds away from the hospital. We kind of set up these, initially they were tents right outside back, and so all the head injury cases were sort of moved out of the hospital into these tents out back, and they would get assessments. By the time I was there, we had a hardened facility, a clinic, and so that was what I did every morning. Every morning I just came into the clinic, and just guys would come in, and they were there for their head injury evaluations. They'd shown up overnight or been air evac'd in. I would go over to the hospital, do rounds, for the casualties over there, and then provide, recommendations to the surgeons if there were head injuries, help them to kind of think about how to provide treatment, if there were any sort of psychological, behavioral health issues like trauma response. I could also provide some assistance there. And then typically in the afternoons, it was a little bit more like a kind of traditional mental health clinic. So I'd have servicemen and women coming in. They were feeling depressed, they were homesick, they weren't sleeping well. They were usually the people stationed to our base, and we were just the clinic for the base. And so I had sort of these dual roles. In the morning, I was sort of the warfighter support, and then the afternoon, it was, kind of taking care of, my neighbors and my coworkers.
Were there times in your deployment that you personally struggled?
Yeah, there were times, I think towards the end of the deployment, the struggles that I had, I think are related more to burnout, which, a lot of times it is something that I've understood not only myself as a psychologist, but with the research that we do, is that we often use the label PTSD to describe, experiences that aren't necessarily PTSD. They're just experiences of being humans, in a difficult situation where you don't get a day off for 6 months type of thing. Here in the States, we call it burnout, right? And, it's just that kind of constant pressure. You don't get much downtime. And then, when you finally get a relaxing day, well, then, you're paged to come see someone in the emergency department, and you're woken up in the middle of the night to come help someone. And, and you do that over and over for many, many months, and you can't leave. You don't have the amenities and the luxuries of being back at home, so it's not as easy to decompress. And it definitely started to accumulate, and so I'd lose my temper. I was impatient. I kind of felt like I was frustrated all the time, and so that was, I think, some of the struggles that I experienced. And of course, now I look back on it, it was after I returned that those experiences, I think, have really helped me as a psychologist to help other service members and veterans, to kind of help them to kind of put into words what they experienced, and for them to hear me tell my, kind of my frustrating stories. There's sort of a camaraderie with that, where sometimes I think the patients that I see kind of feel like perhaps I understand what they're going through, and maybe I can help them think about, the issues that they're struggling with in a different way.
What was your favorite tactic for dealing with the stress or the burnout?
Yeah, so you try to set a regimented schedule for yourself. I think when you're deployed, and so there are a number of things. So you wake up, first thing in the morning. You work for 10, 12 hours at the clinic, and then what I would do is I'd go to the gym, and I would work out for, it seemed like, I think it was like an hour and a half every day. And then you go to the DFAC and eat, and then I would go to the rec center and just chill out for a while. And so exercise was a big part of taking care of myself. I lost a lot of weight while I was deployed. Is the best shape I've ever been in my life because, what else are you going to do other than exercise? Um, and then, we had these sort of routines and rituals that we got into. So Friday night was like movie night. And so everyone in the clinic, we would get together and, watch some kind of movie. Sunday nights, we would have like what we called family dinner, and we would just go to DFAC or just one of the vendors on base there, and kind of do a special kind of dinner just to have these sort of routines that you get yourself in. And or I would accompany other people that I was deployed with, like those who were parents, they had routines as well. They'd go to the USO and like record messages for their kids, and so I'd go with them and just kind of hang out in the USO while they were doing their thing. And these are kind of the little things that you do to take care of yourself.
So it sounds like building camaraderie was really important.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I can think back to it now, and I think of the people that I was deployed with, and some of them I've not been in contact with for many years, but there is this sort of shared experience that every once in a while you do kind of get reconnected with someone, or you see them on a social media network, something like that, and in many ways you can make crack an inside joke or something like that. And there are these sort of bonds that really are kind of forged in these types of circumstances. And even though we were not in combat, we were not in that kind of stressful situation, the stresses we had were very different. And but it's shared. There are not many psychologists in the world who understand what it's like to work in a combat hospital, and who have had some of the experiences that kind of a select few of us had, and that makes a big difference.
So did the military have specialty training for you going to those locations and treating those people specifically?
Yeah, so I was stationed at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, and so I was attached to Wilford Hall, and so it's the largest hospital medical center in the Air Force, and so we had a lot of psychologists there. And so when they set up this traumatic brain injury clinic in Balad, and the Air Force took over the whole hospital there at Balad, we kind of talked about it was like Wilford Hall in Iraq, and this was sort of the mission of the 59th Medical Wing, was we all cycled to Balad. And so those of us who were psychologists, ran the TBI clinic and set up the TBI clinic and then sustained it. And so because that was sort of our mission, all of our pre-deployment trainings then were geared towards it. And when you were assigned as a psychologist to the 59th, there was sort of this expectation you're probably going to go to Balad. And so when we had monthly trainings, we always had things on like head injuries, and we had the 2 or 3 neuropsychologists who were stationed with us would always, kind of keep us up to date on the latest research on concussion and TBI. And we would get crash courses on assessment methods, things like that, because when it was our turn to cycle and deploy, it was like we were expected to know these things. And so we eventually had this sort of internal training system that was developed. And so even, I was at Wilford Hall for 3 years, and, pretty much from the moment I arrived and was there, I knew someday I'm going to end up in Balad. And so we definitely geared the training for that mission.
When you were at Lackland, did you support any of the basic trainees?
Yeah, so we had in the basic training on that side of the base, which is overseen by the 37th Training Wing, they have a clinic. It's called Behavioral Analysis Service. At least that's what it used to be called. I don't know if it's still called that, or the BAS, as what we called it. And that was where basic trainees would go, if they were having behavioral health or mental health issues. They would report there first thing in the morning. And so as an intern, we would do rotations there. I think it was like a 1 month rotation. And so you really learned a lot about, the dynamics of basic training, about basically occupational fitness for duty evaluations. And then while I was there on staff after my internship, we also had the opportunity to, really work closely with different training units, and so I got to know the operational psychologists who worked, for instance, in the training squadron there, which is the pipeline for pararescue and for combat controllers, and I would every once in a while I could go out and do some work with them while they were out doing some sort of ridiculous physical training exercise that just seems impossible to me. And as you get to know them, the kind of one of the things I miss about being in the military is, where they were training someone how to be a tandem instructor for parachuting. You get a phone call and say, we're going to go, jumping this weekend, and you want a couple rides. We need to train someone on how to be a tandem jumper. And so you get to do all this really cool stuff.
You jumped tandem?
Oh yeah,
Wow.
multiple times. Yeah. So when I was, active duty, and even for a couple years after, what the instructors told me was that I was a sort of an optimal height weight ratio. I'm not particularly tall. And so it makes it easier if you're learning how to do tandem jumps. So I would get all these phone calls all the time. We're going to go jumping. And so in a single day, I would get 3 or 4 jumps in.
Wow.
Because these guys needed X number of jumps in order to get their certification.
Do you know how many jumps you've done?
No, I mean, it's, not nearly as much as airborne or, special forces, but as a psychologist, probably at least in the double digits. And so I would, just spend an entire day with these guys and just strap onto them and just kind of jump out of an airplane.
Wow. Going back to Lackland and basic training, for anyone who's getting ready to go to basic, do you have any advice that you would give to somebody?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing that to always keep in mind is that you have to keep in mind what the purpose of basic training is. The idea behind it is to deliberately stress you out, to push you to the limits, so that you can recognize how strong you are. And it's a head game. Afterwards we all talk about this. It's just a mind game, and it's yeah, that's exactly right. It really is designed to teach you how far you can go, so that when you're under pressure, when you work in the military, whether it's routine operations here in the States, or when you're downrange, you can be much more confident in your ability to endure and to persist and to perform under pressure. And then the other second advice I would give that I learned when I was in the clinic there, the BASS, we told this to basic trainees all the time: the fastest way out of basic training is to graduate. It's
Right.
and so if you keep that in the back of your mind, the fastest way out of this place is to graduate. It can sometimes serve as a mantra to really help you to endure, because there are going to be moments where you're going to second guess yourself. You're going to say, why the hell did I get myself into this? What was I thinking? And to kind of remember the quickest way out is to cross the finish line. And when you cross the finish line, there's nothing like it. I mean, there's nothing that, at that point in your life, can be more satisfying and rewarding.
So how did you get from military psychologist to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I had my 4-year active duty commitment, and I deployed to Iraq actually at the end of my commitment. So I actually voluntarily extended my contract so that I could do the deployment. I really wanted to do that before I got out of the military. My kind of sense was, why did I join if I'm not going to deploy during the midst of a war? And so I was already, while I was deployed, getting ready to transition out. I wasn't entirely certain what I was going to do, but that was in 2009, and that was around the time that the military suicide rate started rising at, I guess I'd started rising a few years earlier, but it was around 2008 or 2009 where people started realizing it's not just a bad year or a bad 2 years or a bad 3 years. This is a trend, like something is happening. And I mentioned earlier that my training director in graduate school was a former Army psychologist, and he was a suicide researcher. He's developed therapies that prevent suicide, and so as I was deployed, he went in. He submitted for a research grant to test his therapy in a military sample to see, could we test this out? Could it work? Could it prevent suicidal behaviors? And he knew I was going to be getting out of the military soon, and he said, I would love, to have you run the study. Like, you basically make this happen. You're just going to get out of the military, and who better to understand how the system works and to make a therapy work within the bureaucracy of the DoD. And so it was while I was in Iraq. The study was funded by the DoD. I got my little letter in the mail. I've got a picture of me in Iraq with my letter saying that, I have a faculty position, when I get back. And so that was how I got into it. It was the opportunity to basically run a research study to test the therapies designed to prevent suicidal behavior.
And how did that go?
Yeah, so the process of running a treatment study was very difficult. I didn't really fully understand it before. As a psychologist, I read research studies, but running it, I really had no concept of how complicated and difficult it is. There's a lot of considerations. And then you add on top of that the complications of trying to do this in the Department of Defense, one of the biggest bureaucracies in the world. You have to understand the politics. The system is not designed to be cooperative, to be easy to bend or to flex, to adapt. There were a lot of people. So we did at Fort Carson, and I think initially there was a lot of suspicion about us. I think there was a lot of concern that we were the outsiders. What do we know? We're here to make them look bad. And this is, when David hired me, this is why he said, you just got out of the military. And so we leveraged that, me going and talking to these military psychologists who were really kind of like, you guys are the outsiders, but to be able to say, no, just a few months ago, I was using that same clunky computerized system that you all hate and complain about. And I had to do all those horrible computer-based trainings that we're required to do. And, and to be able to kind of connect with them on that and to gain their trust, I think was critical. And so it took us about 4 or 5 years to complete that study, and in the end, it was successful. We found that the therapy reduced suicide attempts by 60%. It was a resounding success. And I remember the day when we analyzed the data. I was at home. I was here in Utah. I had already moved here, and I remember running the numbers, and you just look at the output and you see there's a difference. The one treatment is very clearly doing better than the other treatment. And I remember I forwarded the results to David, and about 20 seconds later my phone rang, and he was just like, "Are you shitting me?" And I was like, "Yeah, it worked." And of course we kind of expected it would have worked, but there's something to be said about when you're looking at the numbers and you find out that the idea worked, and we were helping service members, and so we immediately were on the phone together. He's like, "Well, check this and double check this." So we were really kind of trying to make sure we didn't make any mistakes, and sent it off to another statistician to get an independent perspective, and he got the same results. And that's when we knew we had succeeded, and we had been able to demonstrate that this therapy could help save lives.
So was Dr. Rudd the one that created the program that you were testing?
Yeah, so he had started to develop this treatment. So now we call the treatment brief cognitive behavioral therapy, or BCBT. But he started developing it in the 90s when he was in the Army. And he had done some preliminary treatment work at Fort Hood in the mid 90s and published some research. And that was actually the only research of suicide treatments with military personnel until now, 2015. We published ours. So 20 years between the first and the second study looking at treatments in the military. And in those 20 years, he had continued to refine and develop the treatment. And then there was a version of the treatment that was tested by some of our colleagues and friends at the University of Pennsylvania who tested it with civilians. And they were able to show it worked with civilians. And that was, in many ways, the first study showing that this treatment approach can reduce suicidal behaviors. And so we just adapted it a little bit more and tested it in the military.
So are there ways that somebody can self-diagnose before they get to the stage of suicidal ideation? Like what would they be looking for in themselves that they would notice that they are getting into a dangerous place?
Yeah, so what I like to talk about with people is what I call the coded language of suicide. And what I mean by this is, um, a lot of times when we're heading towards suicide, kind of down that road, it's not necessarily thoughts about suicide that we experience. So we're often told to ask people, are you thinking about suicide? Are you having thoughts about ending your life? And interestingly, what we find is that about more than half of those who kill themselves will say no to that. No, I'm not, and then they'll kill themselves. So part of it is maybe they're lying, right? They don't want to tell us. But part of it, I think, as well, is just that's not how they're experiencing elevated suicide risk. And so some of the research we do now, one of my graduate students, for instance, she's finding that there's a lot of military personnel veterans who will have thoughts like, my life isn't worth living. I wish I could fall asleep and never wake up again. I can't take this anymore. People would be better off without me. No one can help me with my problems. And these thoughts, these statements, are very indicative of not being in a good state, and oftentimes are kind of road signs on the way to suicide. But again, they're not explicitly, I should kill myself. And so what I say is, if you're having those types of thoughts, or if you have a friend or a buddy or a family member, a loved one, who's saying these things like, I just can't take this anymore, you ought to be better off without me, I wish I had never been around, I deserve to be punished. Those are very clear indicators that things are not going well, and those are the types of individuals that we would want to try to bring into our treatment programs. And then when you add on top of that things like agitation and insomnia, so you're thinking these things, you're feeling this way, and now you're not sleeping very well, and you feel restless and on edge, and like you can't sit still, and your mind is racing. Those things in combination are kind of not a good sign. And the treatment that we've developed, like BCBT, are designed to go directly at those issues. And what we find is that after treatment, people no longer feel like a burden on others, and they don't feel like I can't take it. They're like, no, I can handle this. They're sleeping better. They feel a little more relaxed and calm, and they're less likely to try to kill themselves.
The advice you would give to somebody if they were having some of those thoughts is to come to the VA, come to someone that can help.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I encourage people to do is to not wait until someone's experiencing suicidal thoughts, because that's kind of, now you're in the danger zone. And why wait? And what we're finding is that we can usually help people very rapidly the earlier we kind of nip it in the bud. And so if you're starting to have these types of thoughts, if you're not sleeping well, if you feel like you just can't relax and you can't sit still, now's the time to go and get help because it's so much easier. And what I found is most military personnel veterans get this in most areas of their life, right? Where if you have, a leak in your home, it's always better to fix the leak as soon as you notice the leak.
Right.
Don't wait for the pipe to burst and now you've got a flooded basement, because that's sort of like a disaster and you've got to spend all this money to fix it. And so as soon as you notice a problem like that, or a crack in the foundation, or as soon as you notice those weird noises in the engine of your car, it's always better to go and get things fixed right then. It's usually cheaper, it's easier to handle. And in many ways, we are built the same way as humans. And the earlier someone comes in, we find they usually don't take very long in treatment to fix whatever is going on and feel better.
Is there any self-care actions that people can start working on? Or maybe if they're not in quite as serious of a situation, that they might be able to use to keep them out of going into a serious situation?
Yeah, there are. And so the way that I like to think about this is, another kind of metaphor that a lot of us who've served in the military are familiar with are just, kind of the different aspects of maintenance and function checking for our weapons. And when I talk with service members about this, I say, well, why do we clean our weapons? Why do we function check them so often? And of course, the reason is, to make sure that they work well, so that, if you find yourself in combat, your gun works, or at least is more likely to work. It's less likely to malfunction. And so in many ways, we have to do the same thing. We are weapon systems, and in order to make sure that we are maximizing our functionality, in a high threat situation, we have to engage in these sort of the cleaning and the maintenance and the self-care in the same way that we do these things for our weapons. And for us as humans, this sort of function checking and maintenance includes things like getting good sleep. And so how do we shape how we approach sleep? Avoiding, doing other activities in bed. So reading, watching TV, having conversations, things like that. This actually contributes and sustains insomnia. So we have like simple rules like, bed is for sleep and sex only. Don't do other things in bed, because if you read and you watch TV in bed, you can train yourself to stay awake in bed. It's about engaging in enjoyable activities. And so it might be exercising on a regular basis. It's eating healthy. It's, going out with others, even when you don't necessarily feel like it. And it's because when we go to social events, when we have lunch with coworkers, go to movies with buddies, just those little things on a day-to-day basis, it elevates our mood. It helps us to remember that people care about us, that we're important, that we contribute to the mission, not only at work, but also at the mission that we have with our families, with our communities, with our place of employment. And when we stop doing those things, in essence, we've stopped cleaning the gun. We've stopped function checking. And the grime and the dirt builds up and things kind of get stuck and they jam up. And this is in many ways what often happens, in that sort of mental health sphere. And so we all have different ways of doing it, but it's figuring out what it is that we find enjoyable, that we find that gives us purpose and meaning, and continuing to do that even when we're finding ourselves in bad times in life.
I love that analogy. I love it.
Yeah, I found it is just so helpful because and this is like, when I talk with other mental health professionals, I roll my eyes as well at mental health professionals. I'm like, oh geez, coping strategies, oh God, self-care and all these like cliches that we've come up with. And I think it's, finding that language that is accessible, to the audience. And when I talk with mental health professionals, I say, we spend so much time talking about mental health stigma. And in essence, what we do is we blame the consumer. We blame the service member and the veteran and say, you're not thinking like a shrink. And so it's okay to cry, it's okay to get help. It's like, yes, I know what we mean by that, but we're not really connecting with the person that we want to connect with. And so if we want to convince someone to come in and get treatment, we shouldn't tell them to think in a different way. We, as the mental health community, should think like the person that we want to help. And so what that means is we should change our language. Maybe we change where we do therapy and how we do therapy so that it's actually a product that the consumer wants. And I've learned a lot from, colleagues and friends who are in business, because they're like, in essence, and sometimes what we do with anti-stigma efforts is we're trying to convince a consumer that they want a product that they're not interested in. But instead, if you change the product so that it's actually useful and desirable to the consumer, then they'll buy it, and you can, be rich and make lots of money. And I think there's a lot to be said about how we approach mental health services. And so I've spent a lot of time, because of my experiences in the military, kind of thinking about, well, how would, a police officer talk about this? How would a tanker think about this? And, how a pilot thinks about this stuff is very different from a person who's in an infantry unit. And that was, I think, something else that I really learned when I was deployed. It was the opportunity to get out of the clinic and the hospital and to go work with QRFs and to go work with infantry units and to hear how they talked about it. What were the jokes that they were saying? And what I found was that almost all the military units, they were doing good things for psychological health. It's just that they weren't thinking about it as like mental health stuff. It was just part of their lives. And what I found was like, well, what if we just help them to see how they already possessed the skills and the knowledge and just did it in a different way that would be useful for them. And what we found is that was a great shining success.
That's a great segue into my next question. It can be really difficult and vulnerable to approach someone who you either know or you're concerned might be having some of those thoughts or feelings. And especially because of the stigma, like there's an assumption that nobody wants help. So in that situation, how do you confront or talk to somebody who you can see is exhibiting behaviors or thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the key pieces is, being able to listen to the individual, but doing it in a way like true listening. I mean, I found that, over the years going to suicide prevention briefings and trainings, and, you see the commercials and the online websites and all this kind of stuff. It seems very sort of cliche and kind of silly. We have all these little catchphrases and slogans: ask the question, save a life, things like that. What does it really mean? And I think what we're finding, what really matters, is being able to sit down with a friend or a loved one and say, tell me the story of what's going on. Like, for real, what's happening? And I think that's the piece that we've been missing in suicide prevention. We've sort of become obsessed with this whole ask people about suicidal thoughts. And that is important. I mean, that is something key. But I mean, just think about it. If you're having a bad day at work or a bad week, or you're going through a breakup or a divorce or something like that, and if your friend just kind of showed up out of the blue and said, hey, are you thinking about killing yourself? Without asking, just, are you sleeping okay? How are you doing? Like, doing things that normal friends would do, that has been missed. And I think that's tragic, because there's real power in that, in connecting with someone that you care about and saying, just tell me what's going on. And sometimes it doesn't have to be silly and cutesy. Sometimes you do that while you're playing sports, or while you're working on the car, or while you're going out and having a drink on the weekend. And being able to listen to each other and listen to the coded language I talked about before, and being able to say, I'm worried about you, and I'm here for you, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about talking with someone who might be able to help, and offering to go with them. What we found when I was active duty, what I found to be one of the most powerful strategies of getting a service member in to mental health was when a buddy walked with them, said, I will go with you to the hospital, I will go with you to the clinic, and I'll sit in the waiting room with you so you're not alone. Because I think sometimes there's a lot of misconceptions about sitting in the mental health clinic waiting room. And I'll be honest, I know how it feels, because there have been times where I've gone for meetings, like as a psychologist, to meet with other psychologists. You sit in the waiting room of the clinic, and me as a psychologist, I'm like, what do people think about why I'm here? And so, I mean, it's very real, and I think we got to own it, and it's okay. But it's so much easier to do that if someone else is being stared at, so to speak, with you, because they're sharing, that weight and that sort of challenge. And likewise, I've even noticed that here, after being out of the military, when I think of the service members and veterans who come to us for therapy here, when they come with a friend, or they've been referred by a friend, it's staggering. I would say at least a quarter, if not a third, of the veterans who come to us for treatment now on campus, they say it was my friend who said, I got to call you. And we've had family members come with them. And that, I think, is very, very powerful. So listening for that coded language, I would say being normal, just being a friend, and then offering, to come with them so that they don't have to kind of bear that initial hurdle on their own.
What advice would you give to somebody who is dealing with the antiquated mindset of it's weak to get help, or the mental thing, like you need to be stronger, that kind of old mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly understand the mindset, and I can recognize it, even within myself, whether it's when I'm stressed or even, with other medical issues. I think of, how many times my wife nags me. It's like, we just go to the damn doctor, and then of course I nag her in the same way. It's like, let's go to the doctor and get some help. And so I can resonate with it. I can understand the perspective. And what I like to do is think about it. This isn't an issue of like strength and weakness. I think that's not the kind of the real helpful way of understanding this. This is really more about getting help, to solve a problem. And many years ago, actually, I learned this from, it was a senior NCO that I knew who really, I think, had the perfect way of thinking about this. He said, if you're working on a project, in your garage or your backyard, and you need a tool for this project that you're working on. So you go to your tool shed and you realize, of course, you've locked up your tool shed. You've got a deadbolt on it, or a padlock, but you can't remember the combination. You've forgotten the combination to the lock. And so you sit there and you try to figure out, what is the combination? How do I get into this, get into my shed so I can get the tool that I need? And so perhaps you go looking through the house to find where you wrote it down, but after an hour or two, you just can't figure it out. You don't know how to get into the tool shed. And so it occurs to you that your neighbor has a bolt cutter, right? And so what are you going to do? And of course, we were in this big group and everyone's like, well, you go ask the neighbor for the bolt cutter. He's like, well, why? Because the neighbor has the tool that I need to get into the shed to get the other tool that I need to actually, finish this project and achieve my goal. And he's like, right. So your neighbor is the mental health professional. They have the tool that you need to unlock the problem and the barrier that's getting in the way of you solving the problem that you need to accomplish the goal that you have. And he's like, so this isn't an issue of weakness or strength. You're not strong because you went to your neighbor to get the tool, and you're not weak if you don't. He's like, if you don't get it, that's just called stupid, then stubborn, right? Whereas if you go to your neighbor, it's called smart, and adaptive. And I just love the way that he really conceptualized it. And I've always thought about this issue of mental health stigma from that way. And, kind of sitting down with service members or veterans, or sometimes I'm on the phone with them and they're uncertain about whether to come in. And I use this story and I was like, look, it's up to you what you do. It's your life. You're the one who's having the problem. I've got a tool that can help you solve the problem. I guess the question is, are you going to come to my door and ring the doorbell and ask me for it? And I found that when I present it in that way, it's sometimes very helpful for service members and veterans to realize this has nothing to do with strength or weakness. This has everything to do with solving a problem that's imminently solvable, and it's just helping you to get the tools that you need to actually do that.
It's being resourceful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's, I've found in my experience here when I work with service members, so I treat a lot of people with PTSD in addition to suicidal thoughts. And what I found is, of course, the mental health way of doing this is we need to get rid of your PTSD. We got to help you with your symptoms. What I found is most service members and veterans aren't particularly motivated by that. They want to sleep better. They want to have better relationships with their spouse. They want to be a better parent. They want to do a better job at work. And so when we talk about treatment from that perspective, they engage and they tend to complete treatment much faster. And so when I train my students and I train others, I say, stop talking about getting rid of PTSD and all these diagnoses. It's like, yeah, that's what we're doing. But what service members and veterans care about is like achieving these goals and objectives and removing these problems from their lives. And when we can do that, treatment becomes much more resourceful to them. It's a more utilitarian approach, and it's practical. It's giving me something that I will actually use in my life.
Coming back to the analogy of the weapon, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's in many ways, like I said, treatment, was it rep, tap, pull? God, it's been so long now, but immediate actions. So treatment then, in many ways, is like these immediate corrective actions. If your gun jams, you do these very specific procedures, and we train combatants like, do this thing. Different branches refer to it in different ways, but these are the mechanistic things you do, and a certain percentage of the time it gets the jammed bullet out and the gun starts working again. And that's in many ways what treatment is. It's these sort of immediate corrective actions that return or resume functionality to the weapon system.
Have you found that there's any situations that you haven't been effective in helping?
Yeah, so, all of the treatments that we use and the treatments that we've developed, that we continue to develop, none of them are 100% effective. So even you think of a treatment like BCBT, it reduces suicide attempts by 60%, not 100%. The guys that we treat for PTSD, we have about 70 to 80% recover from PTSD. It's not 100%. We've had service members and veterans, even though we're giving them the best treatment that we have available, we've had some who've killed themselves. And so that's, those are always very difficult cases. And, we review those pretty intensely because we look at what can we learn from that? What do we need to do to make the therapy better? And it oftentimes affects, the clinicians very strongly. We've had some guys who come through and they just don't get better for whatever reason. We don't know why. And that's a big motivator some of the research we're doing right now, where, when we get that phone call from a veteran from, somewhere in the country saying, I want to come to Utah to get therapy from you, we don't know if they're going to be in the 70% or the 30%. And we would like to have a better sense because we want to help them to get the treatments that are most likely to benefit them so that they don't experience even more hopelessness and despair. And so, yeah, that's, this is something that we take very seriously. And I don't know that we'll ever, I'm not so naive to think we'll ever get to 100% success rate, but we're always looking at how can we get a couple percentage points closer to that goal. And I think the real answer will be treatment A is never going to reach 100%, but someone who does not respond to treatment A probably will respond to treatment B. And it's just a matter of figuring that out a lot sooner in the game, so that people don't spend time in a treatment that's unlikely to benefit them.
Do you have any personal theories on what's the difference between somebody who is effective in the treatment versus someone who's not effective?
Yeah, we have a few ideas. One thing that we've definitely noticed is there's this idea, it's called cognitive flexibility. And the way I explain this a lot of times is it's kind of like tunnel vision. So tunnel vision is rigidity. It's where you can only see a very, very small, narrow field of view. Whereas flexibility, cognitive flexibility, is seeing the big picture. And another metaphor that I use with military personnel a lot is, a sniper team, where you have two members of a sniper team, the shooter and the spotter. And, the shooter has tunnel vision. They look through the scope and they're only seeing a really, really narrow, small piece of the overall panorama. Whereas the spotter's job is to kind of see everything else and to provide feedback to the shooter, because, the shooter by themselves perhaps isn't going to be able to really function at their maximum capability. And so in many ways, what we're trying to do is help people to be a spotter, to see the bigger picture and to provide feedback to themselves when they get locked into this tunnel vision. And what we found is that those who do not respond to the treatments, they have a hard time doing that. They get really rigid and locked in their mind of their kind of perspective. They tend to have, we call it black and white thinking, or all or nothing thinking, where I'm a total failure or I'm a total success. There's no in between. And that's a big part of what the treatments focus on, and the people who get better are able to see the grays that lie between the black and white. And so it's one thing for sure that we're really working on, and we're trying to understand that better, and are there better ways to help people get that flexibility. Some other things that we found is just social support. And so a lot of, well, not a lot, but we've had of those who do not get better, they seem to have a higher proportion of unsupportive families and communities, and so they return home and they're treated as if they're broken. People are walking on eggshells around them. They don't necessarily, it's sort of like their environment doesn't know how to treat them as someone who does not have PTSD anymore. And so what ends up happening is the family and the friends in the community can inadvertently kind of reinforce going back into old habits. So that's something else we've really been thinking a lot about, of how do we prevent that from happening, and how can we, so like now we follow up with service members and veterans like a month and 2 months a lot more aggressively. We just check in with them. So actually right before we were doing this interview, I was on the phone with someone who came a month and a half ago just to check in with them and to let them know we're here to support you, we're here to help, so that we can help to buffer them against sliding into old habits. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at now, and we've been researching them, and we're playing around with different ideas to see if we can do a better job of hitting on these types of issues to help increase the likelihood that people will benefit from the therapies.
Do you do anything to specifically support or help the family or close friends to know how to deal with?
Yeah, so for our 2-week program, and that focuses on PTSD, but about half of the people who come to that are also struggling with suicidal thoughts. We allow them to bring family members with them, and when the family members come, we'll meet with the family and kind of talk about what is PTSD, what is suicide, and how can these things affect family dynamics, and how can you help? And so what can you expect during the treatment process, and what are the types of changes that we typically see? Because as someone is going through therapy, for trauma or for suicide risk, as they change, we want to help the family members change with them and change in a productive way. And so an example, very common strategy that we have to help family members with is, when you go out in public and you go shopping, they get anxious and they don't want to be there. And so maybe they hold on to you. And we've had like spouses who will, kind of soothe the veteran by like kind of holding their arm and kind of rubbing them, and kind of like a sort of like a massaging to help to calm them down. And so that can be very beneficial, but it can actually sustain avoidance. It actually functions as an avoidance where the veteran believes, I can't go to Walmart or I can't go to the restaurant if my partner doesn't soothe me and things like that. I need them to go out in public. And so we'll start working with the family to say we need to stop doing that. And it's very well intentioned, and we very much appreciate the support that you have been able to provide. But what we need now is for your spouse to recognize they don't need you. It's nice to be with your partner. Perhaps we prefer to go to dinner with our partners, but we're not dependent upon each other. And it changes the dynamic of the relationship so that the veteran is more empowered. They feel more confident in themselves. They feel better about who they are, which then what we find is that improves the relationship. Because, if you're with someone who doesn't believe in themselves and, you're always sort of on call, you always have to be there for them, that's a lot of pressure. That puts a lot of strain on families, and we want them to relax and to enjoy each other and to spend time, doing events that are fun as opposed to going out and doing recreational activities. And you're on duty to always protect the other person from harm. How do you enjoy yourself if that's how you're living your life?
That's a great point. If you could give new enlistees one superpower or one skill set to help them in their career in the future of the military, what would it be?
Yeah, definitely cognitive flexibility. I mean, it's that ability to adapt. And in the military, it's kind of interesting because we talk about this a lot. We talk about like Semper Gumby and nothing ever stays the same. The only thing that stays the same in the military is that something's always changing. So on the one hand, there is this sort of recognition that adaptability and flexibility matter, yet at the same time, in the military, we do kind of reinforce very concrete thinking. It's either one way or the other. It's like make a choice and do something, and, sort of the ambiguity of the unknown and being in the gray zone is not always conducive to concise, definitive military action. But I would say that would be the one power that I would imbue upon all military personnel, is that perspective taking, that ability to ride the wave, and to recognize that although it might be tough right now, this might suck, all that kind of stuff, it's going to be okay. And, I have the ability to adapt to this.
Are there any behaviors or skills that you learned in the military that followed you into your civilian life?
Yeah, probably, at least as what I've been told by others, it's time management and prioritization. And so, like here in CVS, we have like 12, 15 projects going on at the same time. I see patients, I teach class, I supervise students, I have meetings with people, I do community activities. And then, I publish, 20 papers a year, this kind of stuff. And so a lot of people say, how the heck are you able to do that? And it's, in many ways, my answer is, I don't know. I just do it. And I think actually this is something that really I learned in the military, because in the military, you're constantly juggling multiple balls. Things are always changing. And so, you're working on a project and then someone up the chain decides, never mind, we're not doing that anymore. And you could wallow in self-pity about, I've just wasted all this time, and we all get angry, but then you just move on to the next thing and say, you know what, I don't have time for this. And so being able to constantly shift priorities and to rack and stack and to reshuffle those priorities is something that I learned in the military, in being able to understand things like, there are sort of high priority, high importance tasks, and then there are low importance tasks, and then there's long-term and short-term deadlines. And, being able to sort and rearrange things, where something I've been working on for a while perhaps is low priority, with a long-term deadline. Now something high priority, short-term deadline pops in, and I've got to shift my attention now. And so that was, I don't know that I necessarily explicitly learned that in the military, but what I found is when I talk to other veterans, they're all like, oh yeah, I totally know what you mean by that. And it's something I've definitely carried forward into my civilian life.
It definitely provides the right framework to start understanding priorities and what has a higher priority, what one thing has higher priority versus another thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of the other thing related to that is accountability. One thing that I've learned is accountability is, very important to me. And I really, I lose patience with people who miss deadlines and things like that. And it's like, I realize that it's, part of life, and we all miss deadlines periodically. But when I have someone who's consistently missing deadlines, I'm just kind of like, I just can't have you working for me. And I think that value that I have on reliability and accountability very much comes from the military, because especially in an organization like ours, where we have lots of different projects, if someone misses the ball over here, there could be a downstream effect where now it's impacting other projects and other people. And so that's something that the veterans who work for us, they've observed that. They've said that they recognize that we have a very high prioritization of accountability here that's unlike some of the other organizations that they've worked for. Whereas the civilians who work for us, they've said that's one of the struggles that they had, especially those who came from other sectors or different backgrounds, where meeting deadlines was kind of more of a fluid sort of idea. And it's kind of a steep learning curve that many of them have had working for us here.
Do you currently work with people who are in the military, or is it more people that have been out of the military that come to you?
So it's both. I would say now it's mostly veterans who are no longer in service, but we still get a pretty good amount of people who are currently serving, whether active duty or Guard or Reserve.
If people are interested in your program, how do they find you?
Yeah, so they can look us up online. So our website is veterans.utah.edu. They can also send us an email at ncvs@utah.edu. And then our main office line is 801-587-7978. And then we've got Facebook page as well. So there's actually lots of different ways to find us, but most people tend to stumble upon us online, and it's got all that contact information there.
Perfect. Dr. Craig Bryan, thank you so much for being on the show. I really hope to see those suicidal numbers drop.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. I mean, it's a big mission. It's a big part of what drives us to do the work that we do. So I appreciate you inviting me to join.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and found a new mindset to help you excel. One question I forgot to ask Dr. Bryan during the interview was if there were any books he recommended. I asked him in an email, and he recommended Tribe by Sebastian Junger. I had already purchased the book after my friend Angela had recommended it to me, and at the time of the release of this episode, I'm a little over halfway through it, and it is absolutely blowing my mind. I highly recommend it to any military member or any family of a military member. For more information on Dr. Bryan or for links to his books, please visit www.tamfpodcast.com/BRYAN.